Instantly fighting for central real estate, this pawn thrust unlocks lines for both queen and bishop, setting the stage for rapid development and potential early skirmishes. Mirroring white's advance immediately establishes central presence and prepares for rapid piece development. Developing the knight immediately contests the central pawn and prepares for castling, a crucial step towards king's safety. Developing a knight to its natural square, nc6, fortifies the e5 pawn and prepares for rapid piece activity. Introducing the Ruy-Lopez, a classic choice that immediately probes black's knight and prepares for a central pawn push while aiming for queenside development. Challenging the bishop's placement immediately, this gambit aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and seize control of key central squares. Maintaining pawn structure integrity, by retreating the bishop preserves potential for queenside pressure. Developing a knight to its natural square, this move challenges white's bishop and prepares for kingside castling by unblocking the king's defender. Securing the king instantly anchors white's position, preparing for potential central clashes and maintaining the initiative. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential pawn advance, this move opens diagonal lines for the bishop and queen while fortifying the e5 pawn. Solidifying the center and preparing for a pawn thrust is the aim here, offering an improved pawn structure and potential queenside expansion, while subtly discouraging black's immediate kingside aggression by bolstering d4's claim. Developing the bishop to this square prepares for castling and bolsters the pawn chain on the queenside, a subtle yet crucial positional step to stabilize black's structure against white's central ambitions. Unleashing central pressure, white immediately challenges black's pawn chain and opens lines for his pieces, aiming to exploit the e5 pawn's potential weakness and gain a grip on the d-file. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop, 7. g6 sets up a defensive structure by creating a strong diagonal for the bishop on g7, aiming to control the center and potentially launch counterplay. This strategic choice reshapes black's pawn formation and influences the potential squares for both queenside and kingside pieces, ultimately impacting the flow of development and the nature of any ensuing positional struggle. Developing the knight to d2 instead of the more common nb1c3 offers white a subtle repositioning, aiming to support a future kingside pawn push while maintaining flexibility for its eventual deployment, perhaps even to f1, and then g3 for a kingside attack. Anticipating a central pawn push, black mobilizes the queen, subtly reinforcing the e5 pawn and preparing for potential kingside castling, while also eyeing any overextended white pieces. Reasserting central control and preparing to drive the initiative, this rook maneuver is a bold declaration of intent, aiming to dislodge black's knights and create avenues for future pressure. That bishop now finds a cozy outpost, eyeing the long diagonal and preparing to support the kingside castling soon to come. Repositioning the knight to f1, a seemingly passive retreat, sets up a strategic regrouping, potentially aiming for a kingside attack or supporting a central pawn push after clearing the path. Castling into safety, the black king tucks away on the kingside, solidifying its defense and preparing to join the central fight. Placing the bishop on g5 aims to unpin the knight on f3, opening a clear avenue for it to potentially advance and exert pressure on black's kingside pawn structure, while also creating a tactical skirmish around the e7 queen. Challenging the bishop's influence creates a spatial dilemma for white, potentially forcing a retreat or a capture that alters the pawn structure. Seeking to reposition the bishop to a more aggressive diagonal, white reestablishes pressure along the kingside, while simultaneously preparing to potentially exchange it on g7, thereby weakening black's pawn structure and potentially exposing the king. The queen's relocation to e8 signals a strategic regrouping, potentially preparing for a central advance or reinforcing the kingside by freeing the dark-squared bishop. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, addresses the immediate pressure on the e5 pawn and aims to untangle black's pieces. The knight on f6 now has a clearer path for potential exchanges, and the bishop on g7 remains a potent attacking piece on the long diagonal. It's a subtle yet crucial step towards building a solid defense and seeking counterplay. The bishop gracefully retreats, safeguarding its diagonal and preparing for potential activity on the c2-g6 diagonal, while simultaneously bolstering the kingside's defensive structure and keeping an eye on central control, aiming to reroute itself to a more commanding square later in the game. Black's knight embarks on a peculiar journey, seeking to dislodge the formidable bishop on c2, potentially opening avenues for queenside pressure, but risking leaving the kingside less defended, as it ventures far from its protective pawn chain. Preparing to reroute the knight to a more active square, likely f5 or g4, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure or create threats against the king. This repositioning of the knight, while seemingly passive, aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for a potential kingside advance, perhaps to h5 or g6, creating more space for the queen. Opening a central file with this pawn exchange fundamentally alters the game's complexion, potentially unleashing long-range artillery for White's queen's bishop and creating dynamic play on the d-file, while Black must carefully consider whether to recapture with the knight and solidify their center or embrace the ensuing tactical skirmish. The pawn exchange opens the d-file for Black's rook, a potential benefit, but it also creates a slight weakness on e5, which White's pieces, particularly the knight on e3, are well positioned to exploit. This decision signals a shift towards a more direct confrontation, potentially simplifying the position but demanding careful calculation to avoid tactical pitfalls. Rerouting the bishop to g3 establishes a more active diagonal for the light-squared bishop, aiming to pressure Black's kingside and potentially support a future queenside advance, while also preparing to redeploy the knight. Embracing the capture on g3 immediately simplifies the position, initiating a trade that will open the kingside and potentially free your pieces from their current constrained setup. This exchange offers a change in pawn structure, potentially creating dynamic play as the central files become more active. Consider how this action impacts the long-term prospects of controlling the central squares and how it might influence the placement of your remaining knights. Opening the h-file now creates a direct assault path towards Black's castled king, potentially liberating your rook and adding significant attacking potential, though it also offers Black counterplay through their own weakened pawn structure. Initiating a dynamic central presence, Black redirects the rook to the open d-file, seizing an opportunity to exert pressure on White's pawn structure and potentially challenge White's control over the key central squares. Reclaiming the central e-file with the queen, White aims to challenge Black's passive piece placement, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for attack. Shifting the knight back to c8 appears to be a concession of central space, potentially aimed at reinforcing the queenside or rerouting the knight to a more active square, though the immediate impact seems passive and delays critical piece development. Establishing a commanding presence on the d-file now becomes paramount, aiming to unlock attacking potential and pressure Black's somewhat passive structure. Establishing a more robust pawn chain to support the eventual d-pawn advance and contest the central squares seems to be the primary objective here, though it does slightly hinder the bishop's diagonal access. This maneuver aims to bolster the kingside defense and potentially prepare a future advance of the f-pawn, creating a more secure structure for the king while eyeing opportunities on the queen side. Refocusing attention to the queen side, the Black queen abandons its active central post, opting for a more reserved position to potentially support a future pawn push or defend against an impending kingside attack. Repositioning the rook to the d-file aims to consolidate control over this central artery, preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvering that could exploit the slight disorganization in Black's camp. The knight's journey to the queenside aims to challenge the central pawn structure and prepare for activity on the b-file. Pushing the queenside pawn forward aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially gain space, while the knight on b6 is now put on the defensive. Black solidifies their central presence and prepares to potentially contest the open d-file, while also keeping an eye on White's pawn structure's potential weaknesses. Shifting the bishop back to its diagonal aims to re-establish control over the long-range diagonals, particularly the a2-g8 diagonal, which is currently dominated by Black's dark-squared bishop on e6. This repositioning also guards against potential tactical incursions by black's pieces, like a rook swing to the queenside or a knight outpost on d4. White is looking to untangle pieces and prepare for a more active central presence, potentially by advancing the d-pawn or mobilizing the kingside rook. It's a strategic repositioning, a patient build-up, rather than an immediate tactical strike. Shedding the rook from the d-file is a bold, almost defiant decision, aiming to dislodge the opponent's highly centralized queen and potentially simplify the position, though it opens up new avenues for White's powerful bishop pair. Reclaiming the queen after the exchange on d2 solidifies White's central presence and prepares for further maneuvering on the queen side, aiming to exploit the pawn structure created by the recent exchange and potentially launch a breakthrough. Shedding the bishop pair in this Ruy-Lopez variation presents an interesting positional dilemma for black. While it simplifies matters, it also relinquishes a key long-term advantage, potentially allowing White's rook's greater dominion over open files. The structural integrity of White's queenside now demands attention after this capturing maneuver, aiming to reactivate the pawn and potentially create a passed pawn down the file, but at the cost of leaving the king's diagonal somewhat exposed to black's bishop pair. The queen, after its brief sortie across the board, now reestablishes a protective presence, eyeing the potentially vulnerable kingside pawns and seeking a more harmonized deployment with its rooks for future operations. Cracking open the queenside with c4 aims to exploit the potential for pawn breaks and gain space, challenging black's setup and potentially creating weaknesses on the light squares that have been somewhat neglected. A defensive repositioning, the bishop retreats from the awkward diagonal to a more solid outpost, aiming to bolster the kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential queenside expansion from White. Unleashing a pawn storm, White forcefully seizes control of the d5 square, restricting black's knight mobility and preparing to shatter the opposing pawn structure. The knight's retreat to c8, while seemingly passive, repositions it to a square from which it can potentially influence the queenside and support future pawn advances. This maneuver acknowledges White's strong pawn chain and seeks to untangle black's pieces, particularly the isolated c-pawn, and prepare for a more active role on the queenside, potentially challenging White's queenside space advantage. Unleashing a daring queen maneuver, White aims to disrupt black's cramped queenside and exploit the exposed pawn chain, creating dynamic imbalances by venturing deep into enemy territory where immediate support is scarce. The queen's foray into enemy territory might seem audacious, but it invites immediate counterplay and sacrifices positional solidity for a fleeting tactical opportunity that might not even materialize. Sensing an opportunity in the fractured pawn structure, White boldly intercepts black's initiative, aiming to exploit the exposed queen and potentially disrupt coordination on the queenside by snatching this advanced pawn. The bishop's repositioning to g5 aims to immediately challenge White's newly established queenside pawn majority, particularly the c5 outpost and the looming b4 pawn, while simultaneously preparing to contest the crucial d-file. Suddenly breaking the tension, the knight sacrifice opens a clear pathway for White's queen to attack black's king and exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure, aiming to force an advantageous endgame through material gain. Opening the h-file like this dramatically alters the pawn structure around black's king, creating immediate dynamic imbalances. Seizing the initiative, White's queen embarks on a daring raid to the queenside, targeting a vulnerable pawn that, if captured, could unravel black's entire structure and disrupt their defensive coordination, while simultaneously threatening to infiltrate further into enemy territory. Black's e7 aims to relocate the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting White's advanced queenside pawn or supporting a future rd8d6 maneuver, while also offering an escape route for the king if the center opens up further. The queen's repositioning hints at a potential pawn storm preparation on the kingside, or perhaps a subtle maneuver to exploit the newly opened c-file and challenge the knight's placement on b6. The rook's retreat to its own defense, a prudent step, recognizes that White's queen now aggressively occupies the 7th rank, posing a direct threat to any unprepared piece. This repositioning, while seemingly passive, aims to solidify the pawn structure and prepare for a potential counterplay on the queen side. Black is subtly trying to untangle its pieces and might be considering a move like b5 to challenge white's pawn advances, or perhaps a maneuver with the knight to reinforce the kingside or find an outpost. The current placement of the queen on the 7th is a double-edged sword. It pressures, but also leaves it slightly exposed to coordinated attacks if black can activate its pieces effectively. A surprising retreat, shifting the queen away from its aggressive outpost, perhaps aiming to consolidate or regroup, but it potentially abandons control over the d-file and allows black's rook to become more active on the 7th rank. The monarch ventures out, seeking active participation on the central front, a bold endeavor given the exposed nature of the d-file and the potential for peace incursions. The regal queen embarks on a daring sortie, aiming to shatter black's pawn structure and disrupt the delicate balance. Challenging the queen's advanced position with this pawn grab initiates a fascinating pawn endgame dynamic, forcing a critical decision about material balance versus the potential for white's king to become exposed. Opening a new avenue for the knight towards the kingside offers dynamic counterplay against black's somewhat passive structure. The rook's descent to the 1st rank immediately challenges the open file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. Striking at the exposed queen offers a tantalizing chance to regain material, yet it risks overextending the king's defenses as the queens depart the board. The queen's repositioning to b3 introduces a dynamic element, aiming to exploit the open files and potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure. Black hopes to create threats on the queen side or perhaps even eye the king if white is not careful. This maneuver is about flexibility and creating options, shifting the battleground. Pouncing on the open d-file, white aims to dislodge the black king and potentially exploit the weakened kingside structure, creating immediate pressure that black must now urgently address. A surprising retreat, the knight's journey back to g8 seems to surrender the central fight entirely, perhaps aiming for a defensive consolidation. But it feels like a passive acceptance of white's growing spatial advantage and the precariousness of black's king. A final check of the king's safety before entering the endgame phase. The forcing check aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially open lines around the black monarch. The king, finally out of the immediate crossfire, seeks a more stable footing, attempting to rally its remaining defenders against the encroaching queenside pressure and white's open lines. The monarch's flight path is now critically exposed. White seeks to exploit the open lines with a decisive check. The monarch steps into the fray, aiming to solidify its position amidst the swirling pawn storm and the newly opened king's file, a bold if slightly precarious maneuver as the white knight circles for an attack. The knight's arrival at f6 creates a devastating discovered attack, forcing the black king out into the open and threatening immediate material gain with the queen. Accepting the knight's sacrifice opens a direct assault on the weakened king position, forcing a precarious escape route. Seizing the initiative with relentless pressure, this rook sacrifice is a brilliant tactical stroke that ignites a mating attack by opening critical lines towards the exposed black king. The king's journey home is fraught with peril, a desperate scramble for safety as enemy forces converge. It's a testament to the pressures of a losing position when even a simple step back offers a glimmer of hope. Securing the monarch offers a crucial respite, allowing the king to retreat from the perilous open files and potentially find safety behind the advancing pawns. A crucial defensive maneuver emerges, aiming to obstruct white's powerful bishop from exerting further influence on the kingside, and potentially offering a slight repositioning for black's rook to a more active square on the f-file. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority offers a potent avenue for white to generate winning chances, particularly as black's king remains exposed. Recognizing the inescapable pawn threat on g7, the black king chooses a slight repositioning to a more open square, though it doesn't significantly alter the precarious nature of its current situation. Re-establishing pressure on the 7th rank, the queen's presence on d5 now directly targets the weakened g6 pawn and creates discomfort for black's king. Seeking any semblance of counterplay, black boldly ventures the queen to the first rank, a desperate attempt to disrupt white's suffocating control and perhaps stir up some tactical chaos. Unleashing a decisive check, white aims to exploit the exposed black monarch and force further concessions before the material advantage becomes overwhelming. Sensing a defensive posture developing, black shuffles the monarch to a slightly more sheltered position, aiming to consolidate the kingside while white's queen prowls for weaknesses. Solidifying control over the queenside and paving the way for the rook to become more active along the opened file.